These are islands, and that's about as far as one can go into the matter before one side perceives bias towards the other. The very act of naming this archipelago implies an opinion. To Britain, they're the Falklands, to Argentina, they're the Malvinas, and to both, they're theirs. 4 decades ago, the two countries fought a bloody 10-week war over the islands, including direct conflict between their air, sea, and ground forces. This remains exceptional. These are large, westernized economies, they share plenty of allies, they're just not the kind of countries that fight full-scale wars against each other in recent times. In fact, by most measures, there has not been any conflict of this scale between two economies so equally large since then. Today, the facts and emotions that led to this have hardly changed, and Britain, in particular, is readier than ever for conflict to break out again. They won the war, and therefore the Falkland Islands operate as a British overseas territory. Its permanent population is said to be 3,662, but that official census statistic excludes the 1,000 to 2,000 people that regularly rotate through here, RAF Mount Pleasant. This base is the nexus of the UK's Falklands defense infrastructure. The southern half of South America is not a region with much geostrategic relevance. That's perhaps best demonstrated by the fact that the US, the most militarized country in the world, does not have a major base in the region. Besides the war over these islands, little conflict has occurred here recently. It's quite literally one of the most peaceful areas of the world, indicating that the UK's presence is essentially entirely for the purposes of defending the Falklands themselves. For every 2 to 3 permanent residents of the islands, there's one person there on military payroll. Each year, the UK spends about $115 million on this military posture, breaking down to a per-person cost of about $31,000. And despite being located in one of the most far-flung corners of the world, RAF Mount Pleasant is one of the UK's most capable overseas bases. It's permanently home to a Voyager KC-2 aerial refueling aircraft, an A400M Atlas C-1 transport aircraft, and 4 Typhoon Tranche 1 fighter jets. 2 of those fighter jets are kept in perpetual quick reaction alert status, which is perhaps the greatest demonstration of the UK's commitment to these islands. Quick reaction alert status means that these fighter jets are always fueled up, loaded with weapons, with pilots sitting beside, ready to be airborne within 15 minutes. Keeping jets in QRA status is enormously resource intensive, requiring continuous staffing by mechanics, ground crew, armament technicians, and more, and RAF Mount Pleasant is one of only 3 UK bases kept in permanent 24/7 QRA status, with the only other 2 in the UK mainland as part of its NATO obligations. Other non-mainland bases do go into QRA status in response to escalating tensions or threats, but no other base is permanently kept in QRA. Despite this, these jets are almost never deployed. According to a recent FOIA disclosure, between 2017 and 2019, there were only 3 QRA launches from RAF Mount Pleasant total, one of which in response to a civilian aircraft, the other 2 in response to Argentinian military aircraft approaching but not entering Falklands airspace. In fact, as far as the public knows, since the war, Argentinian aircraft have never violated Falklands airspace, although the UK would argue that that's perhaps thanks to the deterrence that the quick reaction alert capability provides. But that's far from the end of the Falklands defense infrastructure. This is a Sky Sabre air defense system. It's the country's newest and most capable, and they only have 6. One of them is permanently in the Falklands. This is HMS Forth. It was built at a cost of $150 million as one of 8 ships of its class for the Royal Navy, and it's also permanently deployed to the waters in and around the Falklands. And this is RAF Ascension Island, an entirely different UK base almost entirely justified by the Falklands. Ascension is part of a different British overseas territory, and while the vast majority of the military presence on the island is actually American, supporting signals intelligence, GPS ground stations, missile tracking, and other capabilities, the British military presence revolves around the airfield, acting as a midpoint between the Falklands and the mainland. RAF Mount Pleasant is about a 15-hour flight from Britain, and while some aircraft can make such distance non-stop, doing so would typically require carrying limited payload. It's hard enough already to maintain supply lines for a conflict 8,000 miles from the mainland. Military logisticians actually study the Falklands War due to their anomalous success at that, but doing so with limited payload capacity would hamstring them yet further, so the UK considers it crucial to have a refueling stop on the way. In the event of a conflict, there's no guarantee that the West African or South American countries on the way would allow the UK to operate a staging point, so the fact that Ascension is British is strategically crucial for a potential conflict, just as it was during the Falklands War in the 80s. That's why there's always a small detachment of British troops on Ascension to maintain the facility, and it does serve a continuous practical purpose to refuel the military's regular air bridge flights. These act as the primary physical link between the mainland and the Falklands, twice-weekly charter flights carrying troops, cargo, and members of the public who pay the subsidized £800 fare. It's difficult to fully quantify the UK's military devotion to the Falklands since, beyond the direct operational costs, there's endless indirect and infrastructure costs that could be attributed to defense. In some ways, it's tough to justify as Argentina hardly has any serious offensive posture. Since the war, the state of the Argentinian armed forces has dramatically declined. While it's in a phase of rebuilding, some analyst reports in recent years have concluded that Argentina might have had as few as 0 operationally ready fighter jets as it suffered through high inflation and a debt crisis. But what the country does not have in military capability, it makes up for in rhetoric. Argentina does not just simply insist that the Malvinas Islands are theirs. They assure that in every possible scenario, they act as the Malvinas are theirs in every way but practice. National Law 26.651, for example, mandates that textbooks, government publications, essentially any government organization, must use a variation of this map displaying the disputed territories to scale. One official approved variation, published by the Argentinian National Geographic Institute, is even oriented south up in a way that centers the Malvinas Islands. A different variation of this bicontinental map is also included on the back of Argentinian passports, while an outline of the Malvinas by themselves is included on the back of Argentinian national identity cards. An Argentinian is almost certainly more likely to identify the Malvinas on a map than a Briton. What Argentina's maps also show is that the Malvinas are administratively part of the Tierra del Fuego, Antarctica, and the South Atlantic Islands province. This makes them, from Argentina's point of view, wholeheartedly integrated into the nation. They're not an overseas territory, they're not under some more autonomous administrative status, they're part of a province, and an Argentinian province is more or less the same jurisdictional status as an American state, and therefore more integrated into the mainland than an overseas territory is to Britain. But depending on who you ask, Tierra del Fuego is either the largest or smallest Argentinian province. The mainland portion is undisputed. Argentina's claim to a slice of Antarctica is administratively lumped into the province, and not only does this claim overlap with those of the UK and Chile, but territorial claims to Antarctica at all have little international recognition and have never been formally recognized in international law. Included in this Antarctic claim is the South Orkney and Shetland Islands, which are also included in Britain's disputed Antarctic claim. But the UK has a slightly more robust claim to the South Georgia and the South Sandwich Islands, which sit further north and operate as another overseas territory. Unlike the Falklands, they have no permanent population, but like the Falklands, they also fall into Argentina's claimed Tierra del Fuego, Antarctica, and the South Atlantic Islands province. Now, as the province closest to and encompassing the Malvinas Islands, Tierra del Fuego acts as the symbolic home of Malvinas advocacy. The provincial governor effectively acts as the symbolic voice of the Malvinas, and therefore the strength of one's advocacy for Argentina's claim ends up a centrally important issue in campaigns for the position. The current governor, Gustavo Mejia, built his track record of Malvinas advocacy while mayor of Rio Grande, getting involved in vigils, building monuments, establishing veteran centers. Now in the governor position, he acts as one of the loudest, most hardline voices in asserting Argentina's claim. Here he posted about his displeasure at the UK appointing a former executive from an oil company that operated the Malvinas waters as an ambassador to Argentina. Here he described a visit by the UK's ambassador to Chile to the islands as provocative, and here he did the same with former British Prime Minister David Cameron, declaring him persona non grata in the province. And the province's Malvinas advocacy goes beyond just words and into action. At times they've banned ships flying the British flag from docking at their ports, and even blocked cruise ships from visiting if they included the Malvinas on their itinerary. They also approved this provincial flag, where this part represents Tierra del Fuego, the white part represents the albatross, and the 5 stars represent the disputed islands, including the Malvinas. They declared a song called the March of the Malvinas as the official anthem of the entire province, even though the song only focuses on the oppression of British rule of the Falklands, mandating that it's performed alongside the national anthem at all official events. One of the lines of that song translates to, "No land is more wanted than the fatherland as a whole." This snippet is printed on the entire country's 50 peso note, whose design fully focuses on the Malvinas. In addition to a map of the islands and another instance of the bicontinental map, the flip side of the note includes a depiction of a gaucho, essentially a cowboy, by the name of Antonio Rivero. Who he was and what he did is one of the greatest instances of divergent interpretations of history between Argentina and Britain. Leading up to his era, the British were the first of the two to start a settlement on the Falklands. It was called Port Egmont, but it was abandoned just years later as the country faced economic pressure in part due to the American Revolution. As they departed, the British left a plaque asserting their territorial claim. 3 decades later, after a moment of Spanish control, the islands lay empty, and Argentina was now independent of its colonial masters. The new country believed it had rights to the Malvinas, largely based on it being the successor to the Spanish territory that itself purported to include the islands. The Spanish claim was based on a combination of first discovery, although that's disputed, and broad territorial divisions between the Spanish and Portuguese empires. Regardless, by this time, Argentina was fully aware the islands existed and believed they were theirs. The exact details of what happened next are also at times disputed, but more or less an Argentinian privateer ended up in the Malvinas, either by order or by chance, and issued some sort of formal declaration of the country's claim. This forms part of Argentina's modern-day claim, since the islands were otherwise uninhabited at the time, and many scholars find a mere plaque a dubious assertion of sovereignty by the British. What Argentina did not do, however, was set up a formal civilian settlement. Rather, they permitted various attempts by business people to set up privately funded commercial ventures on the islands, mostly focused on rounding up the feral cattle. The first successful venture came 6 years later, led by Louis Vernet. Vernet did not have strong allegiances to any particular nation. He was born in Germany but lived in Argentina prior to this mission. Aware of the territorial ambiguity, he had gained approval from both Argentina and Britain to go to the islands, and reportedly indicated to the British that he would welcome an assertion of sovereignty by them, but despite this, Argentina named him governor of the islands, likely to assert their sovereignty through demonstrating a formal government presence. As part of his venture, Vernet brought along Argentinian gaucho Antonio Rivero, the figure from the 50 peso note. Rivero continued to work the cattle after Vernet left and appointed an agent, Matthew Brisbane, and the business continued to operate after British forces came and reasserted their control of the islands in 1833. But here's where history really diverges. In Argentina, particularly in the era leading up to the war, the story of Gaucho Rivero was one of a rebel patriot. They say that following the British invasion, he gathered a group of his fellow gauchos and rebelled against the oppressors, killing 5, seizing control of the island's main building, tearing down the British flag, and replacing it with a makeshift Argentinian one. He was then arrested by British authorities as they recaptured the islands months later, brought to Britain, but even the British courts didn't recognize their authority over the islands, believing them to be outside their jurisdiction, and therefore they deported Gaucho Rivero to Brazil, a free man. Most formal historians, even in Argentina, now recognize that that story's more legend than legitimate. Their consensus is that Rivero and his fellow rebels were not motivated by patriotism, rather, they were just disgruntled employees. Their new boss was paying them in devalued promissory notes that the local shop no longer accepted, they were prevented from returning to Buenos Aires, their workload was becoming unreasonable, they were just mad at their boss, so they murdered him, the shopkeeper that refused their notes, and their allies. As for the legal side, well, it's true that the rebels were released by the British judicial system, but it wasn't that the courts didn't believe Britain held control of the Falklands. Rather, it was that the courts in England didn't have jurisdiction over the Falklands. In the British legal system, colonies had their own semi-autonomous government with a local judicial system, but that hadn't yet been set up in the islands. After all, it hadn't even been a year since they reasserted their sovereignty. Lacking jurisdiction, the courts therefore determined that they couldn't hold the trial. In the century that followed, the British maintained control of the Falklands and grew the population from dozens to hundreds to thousands of predominantly ethnically British settlers. And while the two sides never relinquished their claims, tensions remained relatively low. Each side occasionally offered the other opportunity to negotiate, but they never came to terms and hardly any real action occurred. But in the aftermath of World War II, there was a global push for decolonization, leading to Britain relinquishing much of its overseas territory, and Argentina seemed to perceive this as an opportunity. Rhetoric and pressure ramped up, and during the 1970s, the two sides entered into more regular, more serious negotiations to attempt to rectify their differences. While there were plenty of ideas thrown around, the most momentum centered around a concept mimicking that of Hong Kong. A formal transfer of sovereignty to Argentina alongside a 99-year lease deal back to Britain. The thought was that this would give generations of notice to the islanders to calibrate their lives accordingly. Britain appeared open to this, as there was a growing consensus that the Falklands dispute was a nuisance. While they were confident in their position, the practical diplomatic and economic negatives outweighed the benefits of continued control of the islands. Argentina, meanwhile, was taken over by a military dictatorship in 1976, and these new leaders started to form a partially correct but ultimately catastrophic opinion. Britain really did not care about the Falklands. To test their theory, they sent a small squad to the island of Thule in the also disputed South Sandwich Islands, and they set up a base. It took months for Britain to even realize what they'd done. Essentially, from the British point of view, an invasion of their sovereign territory, but Britain hardly responded. They lodged diplomatic protests, but for the most part, left the Argentinian base alone. Another signal came from a series of defense cuts made by the Thatcher government in 1981. They decided to decommission the HMS Endurance, the only Royal Navy vessel dedicated to South Atlantic patrol and therefore Falklands defense. This acted as another signal of British apathy to the Argentinians, and they therefore concluded that Britain likely would not resist an Argentinian military invasion. It just wasn't worth it. This, of course, was wrong. Argentina successfully invaded and occupied the islands on April 2, 1982, after brief resistance by the limited British military presence. In the weeks that followed, change came quick. They set up a rudimentary government, painted over signs with new Spanish names, mandated drivers to switch to right-side driving, deported influential critics, and generally treated the islanders more as prisoners than civilians. Over in London, the Thatcher government quickly ordered Royal Navy ships to sail south, and through time, this armada grew to over 100 vessels carrying tens of thousands of personnel. About 6 weeks after Argentina's landing, British troops set foot on the Falklands again, and what followed was 3.5 bloody weeks of battle. Almost 1,000 troops died, predominantly from the losing Argentinian side. Back in Britain, Argentina's invasion led to the opposite of what the country hoped. In the years leading up to it, few Britons knew much of anything about the islands. Those that did were aware of them dispassionately. They were just one of many far-flung colonial relics. But immediately after the invasion, there was overwhelming public and government support for military action. In fact, the support was so great that it transformed Margaret Thatcher's political prospects. Prior to the war, her approval rating dipped below 30%, but after its success, it climbed into positive territory above 50%. There's every chance she would not have been re-elected in 1983 without this upswell in support, and without that, it's hard to believe she would have been elected again in 1987. So that's to say, without Argentina's invasion, Thatcher would hardly have been able to build the divisive and massively influential legacy that she did. It's at times hard to understand why Britain cares so much about the Falklands. There's not much strategic value. After all, they themselves are the source of much of the conflict in the region. There's also not a ton of economic value. While there is some oil, so far it's only been drilled in an exploratory manner rather than fully commercial. Part of the feelings could stem from Britain's identity as the former foremost global power. The British Empire was the largest in the history of the world, encompassing a full quarter of the global population. That age is long gone. Through decolonization, it steadily lost the vast majority of overseas territory, largely since, in almost every case, there was a local population who had the right to self-determination, and most determined that they did not want to be British. The Falklands were different. There wasn't an indigenous population that was displaced, oppressed, or destroyed. They were just empty islands, and the society that grew was largely of ethnically British people who always identified as British. Therefore, the strength of Britain's claim to the Falklands was and remains far stronger than that to much of the rest of the empire, even if it's not 100% airtight. Falkland Islanders did vote on the issue in 2013, and 99.8% elected to remain British, so at least under the principle of self-determination, the claim is strong. Still to this day, the remnants of the British Empire continue to erode. As recently as May 2025, it shrunk yet further with the transfer of sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius. The legacy here was different. There was a similarly messy legal claim to the territory, but international pressure was much more significant since the UK did displace thousands of islanders to build a joint military facility with the US. So the fact that with the Falklands, Britain believes it has full, unambiguous rights perhaps strengthens their resolve to hold on as they're simultaneously pressured elsewhere. But of course, as the history leading up to the war proves, Britain didn't always care about the Falklands the way they do today. What changed is that British soldiers spilled blood over the islands. Families lost their fathers and brothers and sons, and the war was recent enough that the holes in those families still loom large. To soften their stance on the Falklands would be to diminish the sacrifice of these soldiers. To a British politician, therefore, there's plenty of disincentive to softening their stance on the Falklands. Across the political spectrum, from Labour to Lib Dem to Conservative, there's striking consensus on the issue, even if there's very much not with other territorial issues relating to Britain's colonial legacy. So Argentina's mistake, perhaps, was the invasion. Without it, there's every chance they would have reached a diplomatic compromise, but now there's little international pressure for the countries to negotiate, and beyond the hundreds of millions of dollars in spending to support the islands, there's little incentive for Britain to change their stance. In Argentina, current willingness to press the issue appears relatively low, but that could change at any moment. The truth, on both sides, is that the average Argentinian or Briton doesn't really care that much about the islands, but they can be made to care. The islands have always proved a useful tool to drum up powerful nationalist sentiments, so whenever that next proves useful for politicians on either side, that's when the islands will gain relevancy once again. Clearly, learning about the Falklands doesn't have the most relevancy to day-to-day life today, but what that tells me is that you're likely the type of person who genuinely enjoys learning. You like leveling up your knowledge because even if something is not immediately applicable, having background knowledge always pays off in the long term. That's exactly my thinking with STEM subjects. Even though they're not directly applicable to my day-to-day job or life, I still find it really useful to have that baseline knowledge, and that's why I'm such a fan of our sponsor, Brilliant. They're a STEM learning platform that has these masterfully designed courses. I know they're masterfully designed because I massively struggle with math in school, and yet I totally understand things that I absolutely did not previously when learning on Brilliant. They break their subjects down into small little chunks and teach fundamental, intuitive principles before getting into the larger topics, so you don't just memorize how to do things, you truly understand them. The way you learn is primarily through interactive problem solving, so there's not rote memorization, it's hands-on learning. In fact, this has proven to be 6 times more effective than watching videos of lectures, for example. I especially appreciate how Brilliant makes it practical to fit learning into your everyday life, which inevitably is busy. You don't necessarily have time to sit down at a computer and watch an hour-long lecture, but you do have 5 or 10 minutes waiting for the bus when you can knock out one exercise on your phone. If you do that enough, you can start to understand subjects that you might have thought you never would, like calculus or digital circuits or how AI works. With just a small daily commitment, you can totally transform your understanding of these fundamental STEM subjects, and you'll probably learn to love that process of daily learning, waking up each day slightly smarter than the last. You can even test it out without much commitment, since if you head over to brilliant.org/Wendover, scan the QR code on screen, or click the link in the description, you can start learning for free. Brilliant's also given our viewers 20% off an annual premium subscription, which gives you unlimited daily access to everything on Brilliant.